Now let's think about executive functioning and the brain. We know that the home of executive functioning is the prefrontal cortex. This is the very frontal part of the brain, and this is the home of executive functioning. But not only that, this part of the brain is very strongly connected to many other regions of the brain that control many different activities, such as sight, language, and hearing. We know that the prefrontal cortex has had changes over evolution, and that the human prefrontal cortex is particularly large, relatively large compared to other parts of the brain, and particularly complex. And this is also partly true of our nearest evolutionary counterparts, which are the great apes, such as gorillas, for example, or chimpanzees. And what we can see here is that relative to other animals, humans, again, have this larger and more complex prefrontal cortex. And perhaps if we look at the graph, we notice that certainly in relation to other areas of the brain, such as the motor areas that we use to control our movement, humans have a disproportionately large prefrontal cortex. And the only other kind of group of animals that seems to differentiate themselves from many other creatures are the great apes that are our closest evolutionary siblings. And this is one of the reasons why we might in fact find a Planet of the Apes, because we know that this large prefrontal cortex that the great apes have that helps with executive functioning also seems to allow them to have more complex social relationships, the ability to sometimes manipulate and use tools, and in perhaps the vision of the creators of Planet of the Apes, at some point in time, it may have well resulted in them having a culture that surpasses humans. So that's one of the reasons perhaps why the creators of the Planet of the Apes TV series and movie series chose apes instead of cats, dogs, or mice. When we think about develop and executive function, we know that there's some pretty critical time periods within development that executive function improves in leaps and bounds. And during these critical periods, it's important that we encourage learning and provide the right environment for students to develop and mature and refine these skills. For example, between the age of 3.5 to say 8 years old, and then subsequently during early and mid-adolescence, we notice really intense periods of development in regards to executive functioning and the skills that are part of executive functioning. One of the things we do need to think about is that amongst adolescents in particular, there is somewhat of an imbalance between development of different parts of the brain. We have a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is the home of executive functioning. Now, while this part of the brain is indeed maturing, it matures slowly. So it doesn't complete full maturation until the mid-20s or so. However, there's another part of the brain that's very much focused on pleasure-seeking and reward and having fun, and this is called the limbic part of the brain, the limbic system. Now, unfortunately, in adolescence, we find that there's an imbalance because while the prefrontal cortex, the home of executive functioning, is maturing but very slowly, the limbic system develops and matures very, very quickly. Ironically, the limbic system matures, but it leads to rather immature behavior. And if we look at this graph, we can see that it is during adolescence that the difference between the development of the limbic, reward, pleasure-seeking, risk-taking part of the brain is greatest in terms of that being very developed and the prefrontal cortex being rather slow to mature and underdeveloped. And that certainly puts adolescents at risk due to this imbalance. And we can think about this in another way, and that's to say the CEO part of the brain that we describe executive function as being the chief executive officer, being the CEO and planning and strategizing. Well, what if instead of having a very responsible CEO, you've got somebody there that's reckless and impulsive and pleasure-seeking? I don't think you're going to notice very good corporate behavior. So really during adolescence, who really is a CEO? It might not be the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, the responsible part of the brain, but in fact it might be the limbic system, this pleasure-seeking, animal-like, reward-sensitive part of the brain. This has certainly not been lost on insurance companies, because as they know that adolescents and teenagers have this imbalance where the risk-taking parts of the brain are much more active and this mature prefrontal cortex is much slower to develop, that unfortunately these individuals have more reckless behavior, more impulsive behavior, more car accidents. And one of the things that we can say is that car insurance rates are very high when somebody's 16, 17, 18. They do drop over time as that prefrontal cortex matures, typically occurring in the mid-20s. Scientific research, neuroimaging, has really shown that's the case. One of the things that we see is that from the age of 5 through to 20 through to 25, we have this slow maturation of the brain, and in particular the prefrontal cortex. And prefrontal cortex maturation tends to occur very much towards the end of this maturation process. And in this neuroimaging figure, we can see that the maturation is represented by the blue, and it's only towards the end of adolescence and in young adulthood that we notice that the frontal part of the brain becomes blue and becomes mature. Now, when we say that the brain becomes mature, what exactly is it that we mean? What we mean is that the brain becomes myelinated. Now, what does that mean? Myelin is a fatty-like substance that surrounds nerve cells. When it does this, the myelin helps nerve cells to transmit their electrical impulses faster than ever. This means that parts of the brain that are myelinated, what we would say are more mature, are able to transmit their impulses better than other parts of the brain, and effectively are better able to be connected and part of this kind of decision-making process that we have. Now, let's look at myelin and see that if we have a nerve cell that doesn't have myelin, we're looking at electrical impulses traveling between 1 and 20 miles an hour. Add in myelin, and it's like a massive rocket boost. We see the electrical impulses traveling at 150, 200, or 300 miles an hour.